September 1683. Outside the walls of one city, two empires that had spent 300 years testing each other's strength were about to decide, in a single day, whose flag would fly over Europe. This is the battle that changed Europe forever. A Grand Vizier who staked his life on one impossible conquest, an emperor who fled his own capital in the night, and a king who rode 1,000 miles to save a city that wasn't even his, and became a legend because of it. Three men, one gate, and the fate of a continent. This is the story of the Battle of Vienna. To understand why one battle could change everything, you have to understand the world that made it possible. By the late 1600s, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from North Africa to the Persian Gulf, from Arabia to the edge of Hungary. It was the most powerful Muslim empire on earth, and for over 2 centuries, it had been pushing steadily into Christian Europe. Vienna stood at the edge of that ambition. Twice already, Ottoman armies had marched on it. Twice, it had held, but the empire's rulers never stopped believing that the third time would be different. Facing them was the Habsburg Empire, a sprawling, fractured collection of Catholic territories held together less by strength than by marriage, treaty, and sheer stubbornness. Its emperor, Leopold I, was no warrior. He was a quiet, deeply religious man who preferred music and theology to the battlefield. At the center of the Ottoman war machine stood one man with everything to prove: Kara Mustafa Pasha, Grand Vizier of the empire, effectively its prime minister and commander of its armies. Kara Mustafa hadn't simply inherited power. He had married into it, clawed his way up through court politics, and now commanded the largest army the Ottomans had fielded in a generation. But ambition has a price. Those around him whispered that he didn't just want victory. He wanted Vienna itself, as a personal trophy, a city he intended to rule as his own. He convinced the Sultan that the time had come. Not a raid, not a border skirmish, a full campaign to take the imperial capital of Christian Europe. By spring of 1683, an army of well over 100,000 men, soldiers, engineers, and camp followers, began marching toward Vienna. Word reached Emperor Leopold I in Vienna weeks before the army arrived, and Leopold faced an impossible choice: stay and risk capture, or worse, becoming a bargaining chip that could end the Habsburg dynasty entirely, or flee and leave his own capital and its people to face the siege without him. He chose to leave. In July of 1683, Leopold and his court quietly slipped out of Vienna, riding west toward safety, leaving behind a garrison of barely more than 10,000 defenders to hold a city against an army 10 times its size. History has not been gentle to that decision, but Leopold understood something his critics often miss: an empire without an emperor could survive. Vienna without help from the rest of Europe could not. His flight wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a desperate diplomatic campaign to bring the continent to Vienna's rescue. On July 14, 1683, the Ottoman army arrived at the gates of Vienna and began to dig in. What followed wasn't a single clash. It was a slow, grinding siege that would stretch on for 2 months. Kara Mustafa didn't intend to storm the walls outright. His engineers dug tunnels beneath Vienna's fortifications, packing them with gunpowder, aiming to blow the walls apart from below rather than lose men in a frontal assault. Inside those walls, the defenders, led by Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, fought a war of desperation. Every night brought new tunnels to countermine, new breaches to plug, new wounded to carry from the ramparts. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread through the cramped city. By late August, the defenders were down to their last reserves of gunpowder and men. Starhemberg sent messenger after messenger through Ottoman lines, carrying the same desperate plea to anyone in Europe who would listen: come now, or Vienna falls. While Vienna burned through its last defenses, Leopold was doing the only thing he could do from exile: begging. He wrote to the Pope. He wrote to German princes. He wrote, most critically, to a king he had no natural alliance with at all. Jan III Sobieski of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was not an easy ask. Poland and the Habsburgs had a long history of rivalry, not friendship. But Leopold understood the stakes had outgrown old grudges. If Vienna fell, no throne in Central Europe would be safe, including a Polish one. The Pope, alarmed at the prospect of a Christian capital falling, helped broker the alliance. Sobieski agreed. He would march to Vienna's aid, and by treaty take command of the entire relief army once he arrived. Sobieski was, by 1683, already a legend in his own country. A battle-hardened king who had spent years fighting Ottoman and Tatar forces on Poland's eastern frontier. He knew this enemy better than almost any commander in Europe. He also commanded something no other army in Christendom had: the winged hussars. Heavily armored cavalry, riding into battle with wooden frames of eagle feathers mounted on their backs, said to shriek in the wind and shatter enemy morale before a single lance made contact. In late August, Sobieski gathered his forces and began a grueling march of nearly 300 miles across mountains and unfamiliar terrain, racing a clock that Vienna's defenders were losing. By early September, Sobieski's army linked up with German and Austrian forces near the Kahlenberg Heights, just outside Vienna. Combined, the relief army numbered around 70,000 men, still outnumbered by the besieging Ottoman force, but no longer alone. September 12, 1683. Before dawn, the relief army began moving down from the wooded slopes of the Kahlenberg, a risky descent through difficult terrain, directly into the flank of Kara Mustafa's besieging force. Kara Mustafa knew the relief army was coming. He had known for days. And yet, remarkably, he split his own forces, keeping a large portion committed to the ongoing siege, gambling that he could take the city before the relief army even arrived, while using the rest to meet the new threat. It was a decision that would define the rest of his life. The fighting began in the morning and ground on for hours. Brutal, close, exhausting combat across broken terrain, village by village, hill by hill. German and Austrian infantry fought through vineyards and farmland. Ottoman forces held their ground with discipline that nearly broke the Allied advance more than once. By mid-afternoon, both sides were exhausted. The battle had ground into a stalemate, and every hour that passed favored the besiegers, who might yet break into the starving city before the field outside was decided. And then, late in the afternoon, King Jan III Sobieski made his move. He had held his cavalry back the entire day, the largest cavalry charge in European history, waiting for exactly this moment. Now, with the enemy fixed in place and exhausted, Sobieski led roughly 18,000 horsemen down from the heights in a single, overwhelming charge. Eyewitnesses described a wall of armored horsemen, feathers roaring in the wind, crashing into the Ottoman lines like a single, unstoppable force. It was, by most accounts, the largest cavalry charge in history, and it broke the battle wide open. Ottoman lines that had held for hours collapsed within minutes. Panic spread through the camp. Kara Mustafa, watching his army disintegrate around him, gave the order to retreat, abandoning the siege, abandoning his equipment, abandoning his tent and treasury in the chaos. By evening, the battle was over. Vienna had held. When Sobieski walked through the captured Ottoman camp that evening, he reportedly borrowed a phrase later attributed to him, adapting Julius Caesar's famous line to fit the moment, a wry note on how completely and how suddenly the battle had turned. He sent word to the Pope himself, along with captured banners and the Grand Vizier's own tent, as proof of the victory. For Kara Mustafa, the defeat was not survivable, politically or ultimately, literally. Retreating in disgrace, stripped of the treasures and prestige he had staked his career on, he faced the full weight of Ottoman justice for a catastrophic failure. Within months, on the Sultan's order, Kara Mustafa was executed in Belgrade. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was forced, for the first time in centuries, to begin a long, slow retreat from Central Europe. Emperor Leopold I returned to a city that had survived without him, changed by what it had endured. His absence during the siege was never entirely forgotten, but his relentless diplomacy behind the scenes had been just as essential to Vienna's survival as any soldier on its walls. In the years that followed, Leopold's empire pressed its advantage, launching campaigns that would push Ottoman power out of Hungary entirely within a generation, transforming the Habsburgs from a besieged dynasty into one of the dominant powers of Europe. And Jan III Sobieski returned home not just a king, but a legend, the man credited across Christian Europe with saving Vienna, and by extension, the continent itself. His name would be remembered for centuries as the commander of history's largest cavalry charge, arriving at the exact hour it mattered most. The Battle of Vienna didn't just save one city. It marked the high water mark of Ottoman expansion into Europe, the furthest west that empire would ever reach. After 1683, the frontier began moving in the other direction, and it never truly reversed again. It reshaped alliances, ended careers, built legends, and quietly set in motion the balance of power that would define Europe for the next 2 centuries. 3 men rode into that day for 3 very different reasons: ambition, duty, and glory. Only one walked away with all 3 intact. And because of what happened on that battlefield outside Vienna, the map of Europe and the fate of empires on both sides of it was never the same again.